academic, and some of them are some of the stories are based on facts, some of the stories are based on fabrication, some of them are based on imaginations, and like there's so many different kinds of stories around this one thing that we're all experiencing at this point. And but last time we had a conversation, you talked about stories that that are a legacy, stories that are part of cultural heritage, and you'd spoken to a lot of people around this issue about keeping those stories alive for the sake of keeping the culture alive. So let's start with that one. Let's
Sure. Okay. So I guess how do I want to answer what is the question that I guess?
Well, it's about because the theme this year is about identity and create the stories, how they strengthen identity. And so when the research that you've done around culture and people's identities being wrapped up in the stories in their culture, how what do you think is the relationship between these stories being kept alive and the culture being kept alive? And in a sense, though, like when our parts of our identity are kept alive, it kind of gives us more confidence, doesn't it?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I guess when we look, if we're looking at identity and values and behavior, I think we need to look at stories maybe from 3 different levels. So, so there's the individual level, I think. And then there is the culture level, which is like the shared meaning and the shared understanding. And then I think there's actually a level that goes beyond that, a much more universal view of stories. And I think if we were to, I'm happy to take some time to unpack that with you, but I think what we need to do is we kind of need to talk about that in maybe like 3 different levels. So I'm happy to just kind of go right into it, but maybe if you have follow-up questions, you can just ask them whenever, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Sure. But I think, so I think if we were to start it from the individual, and how stories might shape an individual's identity. If we were to start at the individual level, there is something called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It's also known as the linguistic relativity hypothesis, which which basically proposes this idea that the language that you speak influences the way one thinks about reality. So in other words, your language is reality. You cannot express yourself without language. And stories are, that's language. It's a collection of events, but it has a meaning. The events, when you put them together, they form some sort of extended metaphor. So on an individual level, stories shape our identity. So I'll just give you an example. I'll just use myself as an example. And I might say, once upon a time, there was a boy named Alan. His parents came from Hong Kong, and then they moved to a rural American Midwestern town in Iowa, where Alan was born. And he didn't look like the other boys in the school. And so the kids in the school were quick to point out to him his differences. And in particular, they laughed at the shape of his eyes. And then so several identities might be formed, from that story. So one identity might be, over time, he grew shy. He had difficulty looking people in the eye because he felt too ashamed of his own. Another option might be, he became very determined to leave this town, spend hours studying so that he could go to a university on the West Coast. Another option, because he felt hurt, he made sure to give others, the time and energy that he was never given by others. So all of these stories are true, and how we write endings to our own stories may shape the way, who we are. And, some of us are very good, at casting our mothers as wicked witches and ourselves as princesses. And I think how we see ourselves and our stories and our past is often how we do define ourselves. And throughout our lives, we tell stories. We tell ourselves the same stories over and over again, and that does shape our destiny. And so for many years in my own life, as I'm looking back, you know, I told myself, you know, this story, I'm not good enough. You know, I can't please my parents. And so, you know, that made me work very hard, but it also made me question my gifts. It also made me, you know, make a decision not to pursue certain talents that I knew that I had. So if telling myself, you know, the story that I'm an ugly duckling, for example, I might be shy, I might hesitate. And often, you know, we don't tell good stories of ourselves. But like it or not, that is the creative process. You know, we create our identities, whether it's positive or whether it's negative. And I'm a big believer that we should write stories that empower us, that make us feel good about ourselves. And, you know, so I want to say that, you know, we need to look at the process of storytelling as being sacred, you know, because the story is your narrative. It's the reasoning behind your choices. The story is you are the story. And often I see many of us sabotaging our dreams, you know, through, you know, the disempowering stories we tell ourselves, simply because we're afraid to shine as individuals. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's two elements to that. There's the story about ourselves, which is based on facts. For example, it's there are biological facts about us, about our race, biological facts about our race and where we were born. That is a fact. And places where we lived, those are facts. So
Yeah.
those facts form part of our identity. I lived in London for a long time, so I identified with being a Londoner, and I was born in Punjab, so I do identify strongly with being Punjabi. And so those are facts about ourselves, and then those facts are wrapped in the meanings that we make about, for example, you talk about the ugly duckling story. I identified very much with the ugly duckling story because for most of my life after we moved, the only place I feel that I really belong is where I was born. All the other places, it's like I'm not in my element. This is not where I belong. I look different. I feel different, and I think differently to those around me. So that story helped me to understand that I'm not always in a context where I feel like an ugly duckling. There are places where I feel, accepted, and I feel that I belong, and I feel that I can thrive and flourish. And so our identities are formed of a composite of facts and also the meanings that we make. And some of those are distorted meanings, aren't they? Some of those are distortions. Some of them are inaccurate meanings that we make, right?
They're often also very contradictory too. So I can say, like I said, certain perceptions, like thinking I'm not good enough, it made me work harder, but at the same time, it made me, it also made me question my gifts, question my talents. So it didn't matter how hard I tried if I didn't think I was good enough. So there's certain contradictions, and there are many different stories, and some of these stories can have contradictory endings, and so it lends to us being very complex, contradictory people as well. Yeah.
And also there's the story that we have, our own personal story. I said just a minute ago that I always felt that I belonged in the place where I was born, Punjab, Malgela, my own village. But that's only it's not anymore. It's I may feel that I belong there, but the people in the village, they don't think I belong there. They see me as an outsider. I will always be an outsider now because I didn't grow up there. So it's not just simply a question of where we think we belong or where we think that we can thrive. It's, the other as well, because we're part of someone else's story, aren't we? Wherever we go, we're a part of somebody else's story as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I do have friends, like a friend I'm thinking of somebody who is half Australian, half Indonesian, and she doesn't know where, she doesn't know, she shares some of those sentiments that you have, she's, where do I fit in? Where is my home? I guess they call them third culture child, third culture children, where they have two different heritages, but then she's living in a place that doesn't belong to her ethnic heritages. Yeah.
Yes. And so we talked about, so yes, there's our lived experience stories, some kind of like factual and some non-factual, and then there's the culture story. So like we've lived in so many different places, and in each place you've probably experienced life differently, simply not because you were any different on the inside, but your external world has changed. What's the relationship between our lived experience and our external environment?
Oh, that's a very good question. I've honestly, I've not thought about that. But I guess if I were to think about this, I mean, if I were to reflect back on, if I were to reflect back on my time living in Bali, Indonesia, and and all of the great things I learned from being in that culture. For me, it was coming from a family tradition, even, I consider myself, I guess colonized, I guess, in the sense that, my parents, my family, I come from a very Christian background, and my parents did not necessarily teach me about my ethnic culture because, they didn't want to teach me something that, they felt, could potentially be considered wrong. But it was very interesting that, a lot of when I went to Bali, Indonesia, learning about the Hindu traditions. I also saw that they borrowed a lot from the Chinese Buddhist traditions there. And it was just very interesting that they had, like Chinese style temples, and they were practicing Chinese rituals. And I was just I recall thinking to myself, hey, my grandmother used to pray like this, and I'm seeing this in Indonesia. It's very strange to me, and yeah. So that I do recall finding my ethnicity in a very strange place in Indonesia, and I guess it felt very interesting to me that a group of Indonesians were practicing some traditions that were never I never was really exposed to. But if I were to, the stories about, I learned a lot of Hindu stories, and I learned about the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and I saw all of these the very, very beautiful symbolisms. The Ramayana is told is told all over Southeast Asia. It's part of the heritage in this part of the world, and it's told in dance, it's told in paintings, and it's it's a story about loyalty and bravery. And so I was able to identify with it. I was able to, it moved me, even though it was not part of my cultural heritage. I was able to somehow connect with this a very complex and very sophisticated story that in this part of the world.
I suppose that's the thing about stories, is that we can relate to the values expressed in the stories, the emotions expressed in the stories, because values and emotions are universal, although they may be, the story may be in a particular language, using particular examples, that are culturally significant, but the meaning, we relate to the meaning, because bravery is universal. It's a value that we can recognize regardless of what language we speak. And the emotion of sadness and tragedy, the emotions evoked by tragedy, we can all relate to those, right?
I think so. I think there's definitely a universal, but I also think that different, I think there are certain things about stories that make us, that are very universal, but I also think there are aspects about stories that are very unique to specific cultures. So I think, like, I think, yeah, certain stories are, they're held by a group of people. Um, and I think they are important to all cultures. Ancient cultures relied on storytellings, as a way to teach the young, and stories, they help to guide people. Every culture has a different way of teaching somebody how to be a good person. Every culture has its own stories to achieve that effect, and there may be different variations about what a good person is. But yeah, I think it is a combination of certain characteristics such as bravery, and they use storytelling as a way to to inspire people to move towards a certain ideal possibility. As I'm looking into my own ethnic tradition, there's the story of Mulan that has become very popular because I think of Disney. And there are many variations of that story, but if you were to look at the Disney version, the live action remake, what's engraved in her sword, loyal, the Chinese characters of loyal, brave, and true. And so in Chinese culture, you have to be loyal. You care for your parents. Why? Because they brought you into this world. You have a responsibility. That's loyalty. You must be brave. That goes without saying because she's a woman warrior, but she was willing to sacrifice herself for her father. That's bravery. And of course, she was true. I mean, yes, she disguised herself, but she was trying to accommodate society's expectations about, what men and women should be. But she was actually true to her own heart. She listened to what her heart was telling her to do. And she loved her father so much, and recognized a certain spiritual element about her that was being suppressed. And her heart was telling her, you don't need to listen to people. You do your own thing. So there are certain, cultural values that are part of the Mulan narrative that make that story popular to this very day. And then I was talking about the Ramayana, which is full of symbolism, story of bravery as well, and it's how it's codified into paintings and dances all around Southeast Asia. So cultures need stories. We need big meanings. We need direction. How to live a good life. I think today we're a modern society that's so completely rationalized. And don't get me wrong, rationalism has served us very well, but we need to be inspired. We need to be connected to the heart. We need to feel. And when you're able to cry or laugh as you listen to a story unfold, you're understanding a certain truth. And so I've talked about, the different diversity in stories, okay? Different cultures have different stories that lead to different types of people. If we were to go into the American tradition, often it has these messages around freedom. Okay, so these Western stories, these what they call cowboy Indian stories. I mean, without going into the political incorrectness about that, it was a story about rugged individualism. Okay, Chinese novels often are about commitment to others. And stories can explain why this culture is so individualistic and why this culture is so collectivist. Yeah.
With we're talking about China and
Mhm.
the Cultural Revolution in China. During the Cultural Revolution, that was a time when stories about heritage were just wiped out, basically. It's like, for the revolution to happen, it was as though we cannot listen to the stories that our parents and grandparents have been listening to, because that has created all this inequality and all this injustice. So therefore, we've got to get rid of all the stories. They even got rid of the teachers. They got rid of anything to do with that cultural heritage. And the same sort of thing has happened throughout history. It happened in Egypt when the libraries in Alexandria were burnt, because it didn't fit the current narrative, and it's happened in Afghanistan, you know, where like anything to do with photographs, music, you know, story, culture, you know, the culture that doesn't fit the contemporary narrative, the current narrative, it's or the narrative that is in power at this point in time. So there is, like, throughout history, we've seen that stories have been destroyed, or, you know, they've been suppressed or oppressed simply because they no longer fitted the narrative, right? So we know how powerful they are, because that's it, they're kind of like almost like these weapons that, you know, people think, well, if we allow them to tell these stories, then we will not remain in power, or our power will be undermined if we allow these stories. And that's happened in the US as well, that the Native American stories were suppressed, and they were even like not allowed to do the Sundance, for example, you know, the like certain rituals, you know, because what was the problem with them doing the Sundance? Well, they might become really powerful, you know, if they do the Sundance, they might overthrow us, overthrow our power. And so anything to do with cultural rites and rituals, the dominant culture will try to oppress, you know, suppress those stories, right?
Yeah, so I think what you are getting into, Dr. Jasveer, is that there is a dark side to storytelling. And so, like I had just talked about American literature, and, you know, the theme of individualism and freedom. Well, as you have rightfully pointed out, yes, freedom is part of our ideology, and every time there is a political debate, that it always ends up in political discourse. It's a very fundamental thing that we talk about. But we didn't give freedom to everybody, and in fact, there were a group of people that experienced quite the opposite, and that was slavery, right? And you don't hear those stories because those voices have been suppressed. You hear you're hearing the narrative of predominantly white people that went westward, and they fought the Native Americans, and while there are some qualities that that are romanticized in those stories, there's also that dark side. And I'm also thinking about, this, Edward Said, the Orientalist traditions. There's a lot of writing that has, a lot of stories that depict, predominantly, like non-white people, in very unsavoring ways, as being uncivilized, needing the help of the West to be civilized. And if you look at American literature and how Chinese Americans, how my ancestors were represented in American literature, as individuals with a very jaundiced looking skin, and buck teeth, and smoking opium, all these negative stereotypes, is a way to generate fear. And so you can see, stories can be used to oppress, and it continues to be used to this day. And like if we were to look at Christianity, and how the symbolism of Christ is used against minority populations, how it is used against the gay population, for example. It hurts my heart when I see that happen. On January 6, 2020, we had this insurrection. That was a Christian insurrection, because you had this group of conservative white Christians. They marched around the Capitol 7 times before infiltrating it, and that was a reference to the Battle of Jericho. So there is this dark side to stories. Stories, they can sometimes fuel prejudice, they can fuel nationalism, they can fuel bigotry, they can fuel violence, and they can legitimize oppression. So we can't always romanticize. I mean, as much as I love good stories, we can't romanticize stories in a positive light all the time.
Yeah, that's right. Because there's that thing about the narrative, like what is the underlying narrative, the underlying agenda that we're using the story for, you know?
Mhm.
And if our underlying agenda is, you know, like maybe we have a very racist ideology that we want to confirm, we'll find stories to confirm to confirm that. And if we want to you know, I don't know, elevate our own culture, we'll
Mhm.
find stories from our traditions to elevate our culture. And so it's a question of like which stories, who tells the stories, and what is, you know, because every story, like it's there within a context. So why have we chosen this story and not that story?
Yeah, and it's also how we it's also our subjectivity within the story. We have this sort of Disney princess syndrome. We always can see ourselves as the princess, but never are we the wicked stepmother. Never are we the wicked witch, you know.
Except in other people's stories. You know, we are the wicked witch in the other person's story, but not in the story that we've created for ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think there's a need for us to we need to critically examine, the stories that we live by, and are we really in alignment? And we need to critically think and reason and think about that.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
uh, yeah, but then I also want to just kind of expand on, I guess, maybe something, there is something universal about stories. Um, so, I think like Joseph Campbell, who is my patron saint, wrote The Hero of a Thousand Faces. And there, this is where he posited this existence of the monomyth, and what he was saying about stories, it doesn't matter if you're talking about Buddha or Christ or Muhammad, Hercules, Mulan, Luke Skywalker, or Harry Potter. It's really the same story. And he talks about the monomyth as a cyclical journey. There's a going, there's a returning, and then you go out into the unknown, and then you're faced with challenges that will stretch you, and you don't know how you're going to solve the problem, but you figure it out, and in doing so, you're shaped by the experience, and you come back as a changed human being. So I want to say that it's not that the stories don't transform you, okay, but they inspire us to write our own stories and to go through our own journeys and to become transformed in the process. So I think this is where there's a universal component to story that I think is really, really beautiful. And it's whether we're trying to figure out how to grow up, how to jumpstart a career that has been stagnant, or how to start your own business, or open a resort, or learn gymnastics, or do anything that you perceive as amazing. Stories inspire us to change and to evolve as people, and that's speaking to the human condition. Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose it's when we are conscious of the fact that we have our own story, because very
Mhm.
often we can feel that we're only a part of someone else's story. We don't have a story of our own. We're a part of someone else's story, and in that other person's story, we may be a pawn, we may be like an extra, we may be a protagonist in the other person's story, but nevertheless, it's not our story. We don't claim it as our own story.
No, but we see ourselves in that story. I think that's how it works. We see ourselves in that story, and we see it's like you live vicariously, and you're inspired in that way.
Yeah. So there's a lot in that, isn't it? You know, we started the conversation with, you know, you say that there are three aspects to this. One is our, you know, the culture, our own lived experience, and then the universal truths. And so we've talked a bit about all of those things. So in terms of the mystery then, Alan, in terms of the mystery, what is it that we still need to be exploring about this relationship between stories and our identities and our values and creativity?
Sure. I think that there's something about storytelling that was, once clear to ancient cultures, but has somehow become mysterious in the modern era. While we do have, movies, television shows that tell stories, and I think we love to be entertained, and I think we need all these things, but I think we have lost connection to the power of stories. And I think that is part of the reason why, people have left churches. Granted, there are many toxic elements found in churches today, which I've already alluded to, but it's that the stories of the Bible, are no longer serving people with that inspiration. People don't appreciate stories and literature because there's no connection to a capitalist, consumerist mindset or even a scientific one. Yet in the past, stories were important. It was part of ancient indigenous traditions, and they retold stories in various modalities, from painting to sculpture, dance, puppetry, and storytelling. In the past, colleges and universities from the Western tradition, it was not always about getting a job. It was, about understanding your humanity so that you could be a good person and play a role in contributing to society. And so literature, religion, philosophy, these were very important subjects. Nowadays, people are encouraged to study things like computers, engineering, economics, business. And it's the role of the human soul, okay? Its connection to creativity and culture that has become mysterious to us. And if we want our society to be sustainable into the future, we have to reclaim our humanity, our collective soul. And we need to have stories to guide us to that place, because because stories give us a sense of consciousness about ourselves. And when we can understand ourselves, we can change ourselves, and we can change the world. And I believe that stories, were you going to say something?
No, I was just, yeah, what you were saying, I was just thinking that, yes, absolutely, that stories are ecological in a sense. Stories help us to think about the whole environment, whereas with computer science or with the sciences, very often there's a focus on isolating different elements of, like, whatever it is that we're specializing in. We can become very tunnel visioned and just focus on pursuing that isolated fact, that isolated logical kind of process, without thinking about, well, how does this fit in with everything else? So a story tells us about how that fact is part of that bigger picture, right?
I have thought about that, but it's just, it is making me think. But yeah, stories have helped ancient people to care for nature, and also to care for each other. And I think why is that so? It's because, when we respect ourselves, we will respect nature, because nature is an extension of us. And we will respect each other because other people are an extension of us. And through that, we could solve climate change. We could end poverty, because poverty is a man-made problem that was created by this notion of isolation that you were alluding to. Because we all, I mean, I'm sure you and I know that nature made enough for everyone, and ancient people understood it. And so what's mysterious here? It's a lack of consciousness. It's a lack of permission that's given to each and every one of us to be conscious of our own humanity, to be able to openly talk about this in a group setting. It's this over-reliance on rationalism that is creating this mysteriousness for us. It's this, that disconnects us from our human soul. And we cannot have rationalism without a soul to guide it. I mean, using rationalism to maximize the exploitation of natural resources does not serve humanity. It deprives us of who we are. And you have a lot of these, these world-class MBA programs that attract these really, really brilliant people to make big money doing the worst for society. And that's very unfortunate. But you know, all this being said, you know, I would like I would like to better understand the role of the human soul and its connection to creativity and culture, and how stories have the potential to awaken the human soul. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, Alan. And you know, when you talk about stories confirm our connection with nature, well,
Mhm.
there is, you know, an assumption that you and I are, you know, I'm sure we both agree with that assumption, but there is the other worldview, which
Mhm.
has led to a lot of these problems, in my view, is that
Mhm.
we're not connected with nature, that nature is simply there for us to conquer, that, you know, that we are human beings and nature is nature, and there is no connection
Yeah.
between us. And I think the traditions, the cultural heritage that we're, you know, we both have that in our DNA. It's like, well, we can't separate nature from ourselves. It's like all of life, you know, like all of life is connected, but
Yeah.
that's only one worldview. All of life is connected, whereas the other worldview, all of life is not connected. We are distinct. You know, human beings can never be connected with animals, for example. You know, it's like that thread, that golden thread between human life, animal life, plant life, mineral life. You know,
Mhm.
not everyone believes that there is that golden thread. Some people believe that they are distinct categories. And I think there, again, there's this difference between this approach of like a desire to simply categorize everything. We put things into boxes. No, this is the category of human. Let's put everyone that is, you know, potentially human into this box, and these are animals, these are fish, you know, these so we can categorize, and when we categorize, we isolate, we segment, we break that golden thread. Whereas
Yeah.
ecologically, it's like we can see, well, no, you know, it's like there is every the life force, the energy, there are no divisions.
Yeah. Yeah, at the end of the day, it's just we're all one big ball of we're all part of one big ball of energy. I do believe. But yeah, it took me, I mean, yeah, I think you know, it is important to hold space and understanding for, you know, for other people that are trying to get it. Because it took me a very long time to understand. I had to live 4 or 5 years with a group of indigenous people while I was writing my thesis in Indonesia to understand that. And I had to do, you know, I had to take a lot of time to, you know, major soul searching to sense that integration. That being said, I do believe that, you know, we are moving in that direction. And I think that certain crises, certain challenges, economic crises, environmental crises, they are teaching us that we need each other more than ever. They are teaching us that we are connected, and you know, our survival as a species and as a planet depends on understanding this integration at this day and age.
And you know, some of the things that have happened through history, some of the things that are happening right now, they wouldn't be happening if there was this, um, you know, belief. Like you and I believe that we are all interconnected, as like energy is all interconnected. But
Yeah.
slavery would never have happened if, or slavery, it still happens. Slavery can't happen if we believe that the person that we have enslaved is
Mhm.
is the same as us, you know, is you know, that they their energy is interconnected with our energy. It's like we have to believe that they are very different to us for us to enslave them. Otherwise we
Yeah.
wouldn't feel comfortable enslaving them. A lot of people do feel comfortable enslaving others, don't they?
Yeah, I think that was like when I was in university, I had a tough time understanding how and why slavery could happen. And I remember a professor telling me, you know, they weren't regarded as human beings. They were regarded as property. That was the mental framework that they were operating in. And from their perspective, they probably did not think that they were doing anything wrong.
And again, it's that categorization, isn't it? You know, it's like we will categorize this set of people in the same way that we categorize horses and cows and, you know, like other, if you're living on a farm, you have your herd of cattle, and so the slaves were considered in that same kind of category. They're there to produce for us. And the thing is that a lot of people who work in factories, you know, they're called human resources. So it's still happening. You know, they're just called by a different name, and they get paid minimum wage, you know, at best. Like if they're lucky, they get paid minimum wage if they're lucky, but they're called human resources. And it's like, if you label people as resources, it's like, you know, in a way that is dehumanizing the, make it comfortable to manipulate them and to, you know, get maximum kind of efficiency from them. That's all they are. And if they can no longer produce, then they are gotten rid of. You know, it's as simple as that, ruthlessly.
I agree.
Yeah. So it's all to do with you know, like this worldview of like, are we interconnected or are we not interconnected? And if we are interconnected, like what is the story? Where are the stories that are demonstrating, or, you know, that elevating that agenda of like that there is this thread, golden thread, that is linking each one of us, not only to other human beings, but also to nature, and also to you know, all living and non-living things.
Trying to think about I'm out of words, but I think that's a very beautiful thought. I think for me, you know, as somebody who has had the privilege to learn 10 different languages and to study, you know, stories and myths from various traditions, you know, I do see the commonalities. I do see there is a common thread of humanity that links us, and some of the, you know, I think stories, you know, words are how we think, but stories are how we link. I think stories have, you know, when we can see ourselves as part of another individual story, there's this empathy factor. That's how we connect, and that's how we build communities. And so in Singapore, I'm just thinking about this really, you know, some of these really cool stories that I've been told that inspire me, because I work with this organization that they try to promote change making through video storytelling. And, you know, they have these really beautiful stories about, you know, another friend of mine who, what did he do? So he started a back alley barbershop to connect Bangladeshi migrants with the local community, because, you know, cutting hair is a way to connect, you know, and there's something humanizing when you cut somebody's hair and you listen to them tell their stories to you, you know, while you're cutting their hair. Another story about, you know, like a woman who felt sad for moms who had experienced, you know, giving birth to stillborn children, you know, and she had this community where they made, you know, beautiful clothes for them that they could wear for their burial. And it's something that always touches the heart, you know. So there's a power within storytelling that can bring us together as a community that is important. If we want to build a community for change, we need to rely on stories to help us to build those bridges between people.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Alan. That's been a wonderful conversation. I've really felt.
Talk to you too.
Okay, I'll speak with you very soon.